This is the College of Arts and Media podcast. I am Donnie Edwards, the College Advancement and Creative Lead for the College of Arts and Media at Southeastern University. And today we have Professor Adrienne Garvey from the Department of Communication and Professor Sheila Guzmán, also from the Department of Communication and the chair of the department as well. Would you all like to say anything? Give us a little bit about yourself. How about we start with you, Adrienne?
Okay. So I'm not sure how far back you would like me to go.
The beginning of time.
Of time. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. My family and I moved here a couple years ago, almost 2 years ago, so I could take a teaching job here. So now we're here raising our family. My background, I went to Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri for my undergraduate degree, which is in communication studies. I joke because that was like Evangel speak for I don't know what I want to do because it was a very broad degree, but I really ended up falling in love with broadcasting my last 2 years of school and ended up anchoring their news for 2 years there. My senior year, I was actually hired out of an internship as a reporter for a local affiliate. So I started my reporting career before I was even out of school, which was pretty awesome. So I did reporting and producing at 2 stations in Missouri for about 3 years before we moved back to Pennsylvania.
Okay.
I went to a station there in Lancaster, the NBC affiliate, WGAL, and I was there for 10 years as a producer, and my last year there I was one of the managers in the newsroom. And I left TV at the end of 2010, really to be home more with my kids. But the door opened for me to start teaching as well, and I really just fell in love with teaching, and especially higher education, and I really enjoyed the college classroom and that experience. So I taught as an adjunct for 7 years before taking my first full-time job here at Southeastern. So I got my master's in 2009 from Kutztown University in electronic media, and I'm hopefully within the next year graduating with my PhD in communication from Regent University.
No, believe in you. We believe in you. You got this. You got this.
Thanks.
Oh, that's great, and we're glad to have you here.
Thank you.
So,
I enjoy being here.
how about you, Professor Guzmán?
Well, I have been here at Southeastern for 4.5 years.
Okay.
And before that, I practiced public relations for 30 years in the Jackson, Mississippi area, primarily in corporate PR, and also worked with nonprofits and higher ed. And so I started teaching as an adjunct, early 1990s.
Okay.
When during the first Gulf War.
Okay.
History buffs.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know what the time frame was on that.
That's right.
But a local university, the majority of their faculty were members of the National Guard, and they all got called up.
Oh, wow.
Their unit did. So they were frantically looking for people from the professional area to come and fill those classes for a year. So that was my first entrance into teaching. So I liked it and kept teaching as an adjunct for a couple of local universities there in town, and decided at some point that I was ready to make a change to full-time teaching. So that's how I ended up at Southeastern.
Almost a happy accident there, getting
Almost
thrust
a
into.
happy accident.
Oh, wow, that's great. Well, again, we're glad to have you here as well, and thank you both for being here with us today. And we've got journalism, reporting, and public relations represented. So today we hope to just talk about the media. I guess you could say, social media and the digital age. And today, but maybe we can begin by framing the relationship between the media, the public, and if we want to go into the government at all. I don't want to limit the...
I don't want to touch that. I don't know about you.
It's nuclear. No, I don't want to direct that part of it too much.
Sure.
I want to learn today. So maybe we can talk about, I guess to put it a different way, let's talk about the larger media landscape, its relationship with the public, and what challenges do we face as a society, and what challenges are the media facing? Have they faced, and how are we working together? How could we work together to create a better tomorrow? Speaking about America and our society, we won't get into the whole international thing because then we'll be here for days, right? So maybe we talk about where we've been, right? So what's been the American relationship between the public and the media, say, in the beginning of America, 1800s or 1900s? What did that look like? How did the media change? And I know it's a big question. We don't need to go into everything, but
You want to learn about the different eras
Yeah.
of communication? I could.
take it. Let's do
You
it.
start.
Let's do it. Let's just not do a whole series in this one. So,
Well,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that actually a lot of communication scholars are starting to see right now is the relationship between when the Gutenberg press came out and where we are in relationship to social media right now and how similar the times are. The speed at which we're getting information is much, much faster than it was back then, but it's the same type of transition where you have a public that suddenly is going from an oral society back when, Gutenberg was coming out, and all of a sudden information's available to everybody. And instead of having a few select people who had all the wisdom, the orators, now you have everyone having information. Suddenly it's an even playing field, and that creates friction
right.
in society for obvious reasons. I think we're seeing something very similar now where it's not that we went from an oral society, but we kind of did. If
Right.
you look at how we were communicating before now, a lot of it, one of the most popular forms of communication was television, was broadcasting, with not just television, but radio as well. It kind of dominated the field. And now we're going back almost to more of a written society where that's what social media is doing. Now, of course, you have the visual element on social media where you have videos and things like that. But it's a majority of the content right now is written.
Right.
It's just, I think it's really an interesting comparison.
I heard an interesting podcast. I'll have to remember. We'll put a link to at least the article that the podcast was based off of under this in the bio for this podcast, but along with some other sources that we talk about today. But I want to say it was from The Economist, and they have Secrets of the Future, History Secrets of the Future, something like that. The correct title will be under the podcast, and they were talking about exactly that. And the kind of revolution, that's exactly how book reviews came about, was because now people could get that. And how do you determine between all the essays and pamphlets and things coming out, what was that quality to read?
Right.
And so that job was created out of that, right? So, but it was an interesting history and how it relates to social media today, which is not where we're at right now. But just for the sake of mentioning it. So we're basically dealing with essays, pamphlets, newspapers, right? For much of American history until the 20th century, really, right?
Yeah, till broadcasting comes about and kind of dominates that field. And, you have newspaper, and then suddenly radio comes in, and that becomes the trend. And then video comes in, so television's the trend. These others didn't die out.
Right.
They just changed.
So how did, and even I'd love to hear about the PR perspective, how that really started in America becoming a factor. But what was kind of the relationship between the public and the media, whether we're talking about PR or journalism, in the era truly dominated by newspapers before radio, before television? We're probably talking 1800s, early 1900s here. How did that look? What was the nature there? Was it like trusted sources? Or?
Yeah, for public relations, it was a good thing because it enabled organizations to get their message out in a way that they had not been able to before.
Right.
Before, it had been special events that were local. They weren't publicized. They were just created. This way, you had a way to get your message out to people who might not hear it otherwise. And it was from the organization's point of view, which did not exist at some point. So the newspaper was a good thing. When changed over to broadcasting, that just enabled more avenues to get information out.
Right, faster transfer of information. So, unfortunately, today there's a common, whether it's a conception or misconception, I think maybe depends on the specific organization we're talking about, but a little bit of an opposition between PR and journalism. So it probably wasn't that way at this time.
It always was.
It always was. Okay, that was a huge assumption on my part. Do we go down that path right now or not?
I think it's an interesting relationship.
Yeah. I think there's more competition now that's probably fueling some of that. But even back then, I think the newspaper did not trust everything that they got from the organizations. And probably rightly so. I mean, there was a lot of what was coming out of organizations that maybe they weren't so concerned with being truthful and having true relationships the way they are now.
Right.
So there was some of that. Do reporters actually use the material that they're getting?
Okay.
Do they trust it?
Interesting. So, and we're talking about the era of like yellow journalism here
Yeah.
and
Right.
all this. So, interesting.
Back then, I'm not sure the journalists cared much about what was actually true. They cared about selling papers.
Yeah.
They were much more interested in making money.
That's true too.
Oddly enough, we find ourselves in a very similar situation right now.
Yeah.
In some cases.
So then, I mean, we're having to make some generalizations here. We could do a whole series on the history of media in America, and maybe that would be something worth doing and putting out there in a future date. But just to kind of the point of what I want to get at today is just the relationship, the nature of it, trusting the media versus not, or have there been times where the media earned that distrust, or and I just want to make sure that throughout this whole conversation we are getting that public relations perspective, because it's so often overlooked.
Right.
And when we say the media, that's part of it.
But think about during the Walter Cronkite years, media was trusted.
Yes.
People trusted Cronkite.
Now, why was that? Because that was in a period of time where really there was a lot of distrust going on for mass communications going out. We're talking about the Vietnam War and things around that time. But so, I mean, going back to these technological advances in communication with radio, with television, did that in a way contribute to the change we saw from just being driven by sales? If we're going to, again, gross generalization of the 1800s, historians forgive us, we'll circle back around to that topic in another time. But that's true. I mean, that was a lot of the motivation there, and we saw some regulation and some processes pop up that we know well today. But so was it this broadcasting change? The radio is that voice that you hear at the end of the day. Was it the television that you saw a face with it? Was that? I mean, how did that relationship change in the 20th century?
I don't know. I think a lot of it was actually seeing a person and hearing a trusted voice. I think you learned to became friends with that person on the air.
Right. So like Cronkite.
Yeah. I think a lot of that had to do with his personality, whereas other media might not have had that same respect in a lot of ways.
Right.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know what to think. I have about 20 thoughts bouncing through my head as you're talking, because I definitely think the more personal side of it, having a voice and a face to associate with the information that you're getting, I think that was a humongous trust factor. That was a big change for us as a society. Part of me thinks the reason we trusted him was because we didn't have reason not to.
It's true.
And they didn't have, they, as in the general public, didn't have access to information the way we do today. So, who knows whether there was a reason not to trust him. No one was checking.
Right.
Today, everybody's checking.
Right.
There's so much information, or at least they should be. There's so much information out there, and you're getting all these different perspectives to consider. I don't know. It's actually a very good question. I don't know.
So then what, and I have to think it's more than political factors. There has to be some type of, what we're saying is the change between the people and the media, be it PR or journalism, went through significant changes based on technological innovation that changed the way that people receive information or relayed information, their ability to get their own information out there, right? Ease of access is what we're talking about. And more ease of access meant a better relationship through the majority of the 20th century. So what about the technological changes that we've seen, say, in the early 21st century through the 2000s more specifically, we can talk about late 90s even, changed to make the relationship that we started to see towards the end of the 2000s, and I think it has really kind of come to fruition today, where we're back to a place of distrust. You don't have to go far on Twitter to see somebody saying that they miss Cronkite, right? So what do you think that was?
I think it was the internet.
The internet?
Yeah. I mean, it just opened a whole
Yeah.
can of worms, if you will. It's
I think people were satisfied where they were. You know, they only knew what they knew. And I think that made for a more comfortable life, maybe. I don't know if that's the right word, but they were satisfied. But then when they got more information, then they started seeing, well, maybe my life isn't so wonderful. Maybe there's something else going on behind the scenes.
Right.
yeah, I think that's about the time we also started to see citizen journalism really jumping up, where, you know, everybody's a journalist, and I'm going to use journalist in quotes there.
Well, let's dive into citizen journalism a little bit. The internet, that's really what it enabled, right?
Right.
Is easier ability to establish some kind of communication bona fides, right? Even if it wasn't with an organization. What do we mean by citizen journalism? What does it look like?
It's literally anybody who has the ability to record information and deliver it to an audience. You're considered a citizen journalist. So everybody has a phone today. Like there are clips of video of things that trained reporters who are hired to do these jobs, maybe they didn't get to the scene fast enough or whatever, but somebody who was standing along the side of the road got video of it. That person becomes a citizen journalist. And they have now the world at their fingertips where they can put it up on social media and suddenly it becomes available to the mass audience. So the way that we're getting information is so incredibly broad today as compared to what it has been in the past, that it's causing society, I think, to question what's true. I think that's a big piece of what we're seeing is that there's so much information. We're all overwhelmed by it. How do you know what's true? And, you know, a lot of that comes back to media literacy, which we've talked a little bit about too. And, you know, checking your sources, check your facts. You know, if you see something posted on social media and you think, oh, that's an interesting story, I think I'm going to share that, please go look at the website first. Don't just click share or retweet or whatever without checking where it came from. And not only that, but who is that source? You know, I always tell my students, go to the About Us in a website or on a website page and read about the people who are putting this information together. Who are they? Do they have a natural bias? If they do, fine, but you need to take that into account before you share it and say, here, this is the truth. It may be truth to one person, but it's not the actual truth. It's not the full truth.
Right. So what does that look like for a PR professional? I mean, does citizen journalism really have an effect with that, being that you are representing an organization?
That means that PR people need to stay on their toes and always be looking and seeing what other people are saying about them and about their industry, about their products, and so on. Because information is not just coming from the organization anymore. It's coming from anybody. And so you've got to be aware of what people are saying and what they're talking about your product so that you can correct that information if it's not correct, or if it's in a situation that becomes a crisis for you, you have to act on it immediately. You can't sit and gather your group around and come up with a plan. You've got to act immediately because the rest of social media is going to talk about it.
Right. And I have to imagine there's some advantages to the ease of access to mass communication or being heard like social media provides. We hear it all the time from places like Facebook or pretty much every social media platform that, hey, we're increasing the connectedness of people to have their voices heard. Depends on the campaign they're running at the time, right? But that's what they talk about. So there has to be some pros to that everyone can do that and keep people honest and things like that. But I would also have to imagine, just thinking through it, that there's probably some contextual issues too. You just slap a video up online and say, look at this. You only catch 5-10 seconds of it. I mean, I imagine that's probably something that journalists and PR professionals deal with too. So,
well, a recent case where the students were charged with disrespecting a certain group of people, and there was a snippet of video, and as it turns out, when you looked at the whole video, the story was completely opposite of what that one segment showed.
Right.
So you can't take everything at face value.
Right. Which goes back to, I guess, media literacy, doing your homework. So, but what? How as a journalist, maybe would I see? I'm working on this story. I'm trying to get done by 3 or whatever my cutoff is, and we're trying to get it online. We're trying to get it in the newspaper or whatever, and then Twitter updates, boom. And there's this video trending on there that's completely opposite of everything I'm writing. I've done my homework. What do I do with that? I mean, how does that work? Because I've been trained in certain processes. There's procedures, and whether or not it's always obeyed is another conversation. But there are those protocols,
Right.
and there's honest journalists, honest PR professionals. As an honest professional, what do you do when your voice is probably going to be smaller than the trending video that I can just hit retweet on?
Well, you can only do so much, and you can't. I think part of the danger of the media in general is it's just so competitive. We're all very competitive people by nature, and so the competition is always there to be bigger and better and be the first. You don't ever want to be the last one to report something. But I had a news director who said it's better to be right than to be first. Yeah. And I've lived by that mantra because I think that's exactly right. Because as a journalist, I have my integrity one time. When it's gone, it's gone. I don't ever get it back.
Right.
I can point you to some professional journalists who can serve as very clear examples of that. We had a story at one point at the station where, so we were in Pennsylvania, but there were a lot of reports around social media that Joe Paterno had died, and
I remember that.
It was around Christmas, and it got kind of. I mean, it was heated. We're in Penn State country. We don't want to miss the story. It's a big story. We're the #1 station in the market, but we weren't running with it because we couldn't get it confirmed. And we're watching our competitors pop up on TV breaking news. They're breaking in, and it was kind of heart-wrenching. And we eventually got it confirmed through his son, oddly enough, via Twitter, that he had not passed, and we were one of the few stations to not report that day, and our credibility remained intact. Doesn't mean other people weren't going to watch that, the other stations that did report it? No, but it was kind of a ding in their credibility. So,
do you think it was seen that way by the audience, or do you think it was just kind of a blip?
I think it was a blip. Even though I say, you get your integrity one time, the audience can be very forgiving when it's something like that, where it's breaking news. When you're fabricating a full story, they're not going to forgive you for that one.
Right.
They tend to be a little more gracious when there's breaking news and changing scenarios, changing information.
But if that wrong breaking news happens a few times,
yes,
then I think you've lost it.
I agree.
I imagine that's probably the same for public relations.
Oh, absolutely. You have to have accurate information going out. If you get caught lying, if you get caught exaggerating the truth, the media is not going to trust you again, and your audience is not going to trust you again. And if you put out wrong information during a crisis, well, the public looks at that and they've gotten your viewpoint and it's wrong, you're trying to save face, then they're going to stop buying your products.
Right.
They're going to stop trusting what you say. So that's very important.
So I want to throw a wrench into the conversation.
Great.
So buckle up. A topic that's been trending a lot. I think really it's been off and on the past several years, but I've just noticed it have some kind of staying power in the hashtags for now, and some news headlines, as well as other podcasts, that a lot of accusations of social media censoring, and even journalists, whether they're interpreting American law differently, or they, as international corporations, are not simply withholding to American law, and just simply trying to. The motivations for a lot of it is absolutely pure. They want to prevent, harassment, bullying, those kind of things, as they should. I mean, and they're a private organization, so that's fine. But I think that's a facet of this thing I don't hear fully explored. Not to generalize, but by the media. A lot of times you hear about citizen journalism, maybe not as thoroughly as I would like, or like we talked about. But we don't really hear about that part of it. As a society, what does it mean that one of the most prevalent communication forms is privatized? Even though we talk about free speech, we talk about those things, and it is there. I think for the most part, it is there. Are there times where those algorithms that do those things mess up? Sure, because communication is contextual. In fact, I watched this is not an endorsement over the College of Arts and Media of this podcast, but I saw a clip on my news feed from a Joe Rogan podcast with the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, and their legal team, policy team, that covers that. And one of the questions that was asked was about, well, do you use American law to enforce what is harassment, what isn't? And it's a fair question. And the answer was yes and no. 75% of their user base is foreign, or rather not American, domestic. So they can't just use that, right? They have these teams specialized. If there's an event going on, they're basically PR crisis teams that go in and they evaluate these things based on a standard that they've devised and released to stakeholders. But what does that mean for journalists and public relations professionals? Does that mean that social media could become an invalid form of communication for them because it's privatized? Or how does that... do you think that compromises journalistic integrity or PR integrity when you are working with a platform within the constraints of what they believe is right? And in all fairness, maybe, but I know it's a long question, but I'm just trying to phrase it correctly.
I'm not sure I understand it correctly, but I will try.
Well, I mean, what does it mean that a private corporation, even if they have the right mindset going into it, is policing in some way?
I understand. Free
speech. What does that mean for journalists who use their platforms and need it because it's a primary way that just as television and radio were major boons in news and public relations and just communication in general for mass audiences, so social media has become.
I think if they're being honest in their reporting, they don't have anything to worry about.
Yeah.
I mean, why would they censor the truth?
Right.
If what they're concerned about is censoring things that are half-truths or maybe are not proven or are outright lies, I think society in general can do nothing but benefit from that.
Right.
We have such a tendency to, again, not check the facts, not check from where our information is coming, that's what's caused a lot of the distrust. And, the general public a lot of times will label something as news when it's not coming from a news agency. There are news agencies out there that are not legitimate, and I'm going to put the word news in air quotes again. But those sorts of things do need to be policed, I think. I would prefer to just see our traditional media be left alone and let them do their jobs. I think, unfortunately, journalists have gotten this lump definition of being dishonest because of what's going on, and it's wholly unfair. Very, very unfair. I know more good journalists than I do bad. In fact, I don't know that I know any that I would not trust. It's because they're trained and they're being held to a standard by their owners. There is a standard within a news station. So,
just pointedly,
yeah.
Answer as you will. You can plead the fifth if you want. Is the media, whichever side of the spectrum the source is on, is the media becoming more polarized, more politicized than it was, say, 20 years ago?
I think it depends on who you're looking at.
To make a generalization, again, I guess today is the day of sweeping generalizations right now, but
I don't know if the media is becoming more polarized, or the people consuming the media are more polarized, and that's how they're interpreting what they hear.
Do you think that the media plays into that?
Some do. You know, cable news is notorious for that,
Right.
where you've definitely got certain biases in certain stations and in certain larger newspapers. But overall, I think people see what they want to see.
It's very true. I experienced that when I was working in news. We would get phone calls from viewers that would they'd be screaming at us about something that we had quote unquote reported. And those of us who were answering phones or whatever at the time, what are you talking about? We had no idea what they were talking about. And here it was a different station. And what they actually had reported was not what the person had heard. People hear what they want to hear. So we do have our own little self-filtering devices, I think.
True. I mean, observer's bias in some sense.
Let me say something going back to the censoring thing,
Okay.
because I kind of have a different opinion on that.
Please.
I'm very much against any form of censorship. Primarily, although I do recognize that it would be good to get the bad stuff out of there, and it would make everything a lot less complicated. The truth would be out there. People would only hear the truth. But my thought is always, whenever the subject of censorship comes up, who is doing the censoring?
Right. Who's watching the watchers?
So it's like, who decides if something is factual or not? Who decides if this is worth going out there for people to decide on their own what they want to believe? And then I think about, from a Christian perspective, at what point do the censoring bodies decide that anything Christian is not factual, that it's harming society? And so anything that goes out that could be...
Or anything just not was the narrative.
Right. So I have a somewhat...
Do we want to give that much power?
Yeah,
to,
I have a kind of a dual opinion about that, because I understand that it would be great to take some of that garbage out. But where do we draw the line, and who makes that decision?
Right.
So it's almost worth it to me to have everything out there, and then those people who are really promoting truth keep speaking the truth, and that gets shared by those who are following the truth, and hopefully that will overcome the other. But I just have a real problem with any form of censorship, because I don't know where it would stop.
Right.
I knew that. I said that to fire you up. No, I'm
Thank
just
you.
kidding.
Well, that's interesting. I think, there's some definite questions that our society has to answer in the coming years about that. The fact that it is private corporations over. And honestly, I use Twitter, I use Facebook, I use Instagram. I have no problem with the platforms. There's recent, scandals in the past year about privacy and things like that. But I think other than that, I have no issue with them. But there are questions that are going to need to be asked, especially as elections become more involved with political platforms. They're being used to promote these things. I know Facebook has some policies coming out that are going to change how that works, but it's still going to happen, and increasingly so. As we're talking about media and the digital age. So we are in the digital age, and how do we? I mean, we're going to have to navigate these things as a society. So, are there going to be alternatives where, if it's just like in real life, we have public spaces where we can come in and speak truth to power. And then there's private spaces where, if you want to play ball here, we have this set of rules. And if you don't, you're free to go over here and say this stuff. But this is a private space. There's a definite parallel in the digital world, and that hasn't really been addressed. So definitely something in the coming years, maybe. If you want to speculate on that, you can. But I mean, I think the question we're really asking there is what does this digital landscape of mass communication look like in the coming future, and how could that contribute to a better America?
I wonder if we won't eventually go to some sort of governing board, if you will.
Or even under the Communications Commission.
I actually would prefer to see them out of the country. I want them without skin in the game. So I think it would be better to have an international board of some sort, and have them helping us determine what goes where.
Interesting.
Maybe not necessarily censoring, but maybe we have multi-platforms. Or I think personally, it would not be a bad idea to credential journalists, and not just journalists, but journalism outlets. Color code them, whatever, but make them go through some sort of training, or everybody who works at this particular media outlet has an advanced degree or at least a bachelor's degree and 10 years of experience, or whatever the criteria is for that sort of thing. But I don't know how we get there. That's a really big thing to undertake.
So what are some steps that we can take, whether it's digital media or traditional media, print media, we should say? What are some steps people can take to identify their own bias, or to identify bias in what they're reading? How do they begin to recognize truth in the news?
Ooh.
I guess what we're really talking about is media literacy.
Yeah.
But
one thing that you just said, talking about people recognizing their own bias, I think that's the key, because I wonder how many people actually stop and seriously take an inward look.
Yeah.
We all have bias.
right.
And to seriously be able to tell what that bias is, that takes a lot of guts to do that. And I don't think the average person is going to do that.
Right. How do we teach it? What are, like, if someone listening to this right now wants to say, hey, okay, I believe you. I'm biased in some way. And I think the majority consensus, if social media is telling anything, is that people believe the media is biased. So at least a lot of people do. So how can they sort through that? How can I look at an article and determine how do I become media literate?
Well, I think one of the first steps is what I said earlier, is always check your source. Where is this information coming from? Who are these people? What's their background? What's their training? What's their bias, if they have one? Who owns them? Every media outlet in this country is owned by somebody. Usually it's a large corporation. What does that corporation stand for? Does this mean that now you're not going to be able to look at this article on Facebook or Twitter or whatever and go, oh, I like this, now I'm going to share it. And now you have to go do some legwork on top of it? Yes, that's what that means. Yeah. Do I think average Americans are going to do that? No, probably not. Because it's time consuming. And it's just so much easier to click share or retweet.
And I think a lot of people just don't care.
I think you're right.
They want to share their viewpoint.
Right.
And, hey, this article expresses my viewpoint,
So
whether it's true or not.
They're not reading to be informed or gather information. They're reading to
reaffirm
get the
their
updates on what they believe.
Yes.
Well, even when you look
echo
and you see
chamber.
how people's reading patterns, their watching patterns have changed, they're not going to legitimate news sources anymore. They're going to Facebook, and they're looking at things that just come up. There's no history of credibility in some of these articles, some of the sources that they have. And instead of just going back to a legitimate news source, but then again, you've got the issue of trust with legitimate news sources. And where does that come from?
I will always steer people to local news. I'm not bashing cable news. If that's your thing, then that's your thing. But I can tell you, as a former journalist, I remember when cable news really started getting big, and I remember thinking to myself, because I was a producer, I had to fill time in a newscast. I knew how hard that was to do for a 30-minute newscast some days. They're filling 24 hours. I remember thinking, how are they going to fill all that time? Well, what they've ended up doing is bringing on commentary and people to talk about one side or the other, and then they talk over each other. It drives me bananas. Like, how is that effective communication? I can't hear your message, either of you. Like, at least be respectful enough to allow each other to talk and have a civil conversation, even if you don't agree with one another. Right. That's fine. So, but I think that's very big piece of what we're seeing in the distrust in the media is that, again, all media got lumped into that, we don't trust you. And I'm going to put some of this back on the American people, where you have got to realize that what is commentary and what is not, and what's the difference between commentary and news. Commentary is opinionated. It's like the opinion paper or the opinion page in the paper. News is hard fact. It is fact. You cannot change it. You cannot distort it. It's fact. So I do think that's a very big piece of what we're seeing as far as the whole distrust in the media goes. And if you're going to watch cable news, it's fine. Understand that one station may have a bias, so watch the other station that has the other side of that bias so that you're at least getting balanced information. But understand that even then, what you're getting is going to be a little bit warped. Local news, on the other hand, granted, I will admit my own bias here because that's what I worked in. It just doesn't operate that way. We don't have time to get political. We're on a daily deadline, turning 3, 4, 5 stories a day, and we have 6 hours to do it. And that's hard. It's really hard. So I just don't see local news getting biased like that. They don't get into the game. They don't have time.
Right. Interesting. Anything that you would like to add regarding the PR perspective of this conversation?
Well, I guess the biggest takeaway from all of that is knowing that the public has more say in what you're doing. What we're seeing from the PR side is that it's no longer companies telling the public what they want them to know. It's a matter of building those relationships. It's a matter of listening, which is something that we were talking about the history of the media. Back in the day, companies didn't really care what the public thought. They just fed them information, and that has changed.
It was one-way communication.
It was. So now it's truly two-way because you have people using social media and they're on the internet. They're more informed and they're more willing to voice what they believe and what they see, and so companies have to respond to that. So it's a lot more of a true two-way communication. And if companies want to stay relevant, if they want to keep their loyalty of their customers, then they've got to reciprocate. They've got to share. They've got to be open and honest.
Right. Yeah.
I think one of the cool things I've seen happen on the corporate side of things, and I'm not endorsing them, but Wendy's PR social media is brilliant. They've really owned. They know who their audience is. They know how to interact with them, and they're doing it successfully.
Yeah,
that wouldn't work with every generation. Like, it's kind of snarky, but it's very, very effective.
Snarky. Well,
we talk about them in class, and it's like not many organizations could get away with that.
Agreed. Yes,
but they do it well.
Yeah, they do. They even dropped a mixtape, if you didn't know that. That is also not the College of Arts and Media or Southeastern University or Donnie Edwards endorsing that.
Very interesting.
Our tech here, Judah, showed me an article titled "How Wendy's Used Social Media to Profit $64 Million in a Year."
Wow! See, there you go.
So that'd be
and that works. That's the good side of social media. Like I think it does get a bad rap from the whole truth perspective, but it can be such an effective tool, especially for corporate.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think that you gave me the perfect segue into this.
You're welcome.
And thank you very much. See, that wasn't planned, everyone. So we mentioned before this about, not immediately before this podcast, but maybe earlier this week, about an article that I read from 1843 magazine about how coffee likely could be attributed to leading to the social demise of the Ottoman Empire. And that really sounds like some butterfly effect kind of stuff, but it makes sense the way that they outlined it. And we'll link it in the bio if someone wants to read it. But it's fascinating that social media seems to be a good parallel. Before, especially in the Ottoman Empire, if you were getting any public information, considering that most people weren't literate just in the world at that time, unless you were wealthy, people would get their information from callers on the street or public representatives or the educated class giving public releases, basically. Coffee shop opens up, right? And now people can go to this coffee shop and they're drinking coffee or tea and talking, but you have public officials drinking over here, and then you have the farmer and his family, coming by, or I don't really know the social demographics, but it's the layman right there, and they're able to listen in to these people of influence talk about the matters of state and what's really going on in politics from day to day, and that is huge compared to maybe like one decree a year or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Now you're hearing these daily updates and things, and it got so bad that the Ottomans put spies in the coffee shops to listen to public opinion, right? And it goes onward and onward and onward. And eventually to the point where social movements, riots, protests, things were happening because of what people were hearing in coffee shops. It's an informal method of communication that was totally radical from everything that had happened in that society, that enabled people to talk and express themselves and decide together what they thought, good or bad. And I think probably the 21st century Ottoman coffee shop would be your social media, just
That's
based on the
exactly what's
conversation.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think there is a little bit, some people want it to be more formal than it is, I think.
And I don't think that is where it will ever go. It's a social media. The keyword here is social.
It's the coffee shop.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting if you're like, as you were talking about, like if you think about the whole power struggle thing with the history of communication, and you look at, again, you're going from the oral society to a more literate society. There was a power struggle there, which is exactly what you just talked about.
Right.
That's what we're seeing again, like today. The media has held the power of information for years. I mean, really since Gutenberg. And we don't relinquish that quickly. See, I still call myself a journalist. Once a journalist, always a journalist. But right now what we're seeing is like the president is controlling the information through Twitter. He's releasing information through Twitter. He's denying reporters from partaking in press events. He's not even having press events. He just releases it on Twitter. That is a power struggle, and that's a lot of what we're seeing with that's some of the angst I think we're feeling from the media today, is they feel like they're not in control. And that, I think for them that's nerve-wracking, because they are the gatekeepers. They are the ones who are supposed to be the checks and balance of society, and you can't do that if you don't have the information.
Right.
So some of their power has been taken away, and I guarantee you that's some of what they're feeling.
Well, it's interesting because you can see the importance of journalism and public relations professionals, increasingly so, I think. Credentialed, trained journalists and public relations professionals. But you can also see some real importance in how social media, again, for better or worse, has kicked the ball back to the American people in a lot of ways. And there's maybe it's not a bad development. Maybe it's just developing.
And I think part of this too is that the American people don't know what to do with all of the power that they suddenly have.
Agreed.
So they're just putting things out with no filter, and maybe it'll settle down. Maybe they'll realize what's going on and start being more responsible. Maybe not. Don't know.
I read something really interesting earlier about what some of the warning signs are for like fake news, things like that. You know, if you see something in all caps, you see something that's not grammatically correct, it just doesn't look right. Probably not legitimate news. Here's the problem. As a society in general, we have devalued the need for proper grammar, proper punctuation, how to write well. We've devalued that so that everybody can write well. There's a reason why there's a standard. This is why. If you don't know what proper grammar looks like, if you don't know what proper punctuation looks like, how can you tell whether it's real or fake?
Right. I think that goes back to the credentialing, having the
Yes.
the training. That's why it's important. So there's a relationship to be worked out there. Maybe we'll get to explore more of that in another podcast. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Maybe just like every year, just come back. What's social media doing now? I'm just kidding. That's
Listen,
not a real
it
idea.
changes that fast, so we probably could.
It's not a real idea. Whoever's listening, so maybe it is. I don't know. But well, thank you all. I think that probably is a good stopping point for the day.
Sure.
If anyone listening has any questions or comments about this podcast, feel free to comment and leave your questions, and we'll do our best to get back to you. There will be in the bio of this podcast some resources on fact-checking, media literacy, and as well as the other publications, articles that we've mentioned today. We're going to try to get that one that Judah mentioned about Wendy's $64 million profit off social media. That's just impressive. Not a public endorsement by the College of Arts and Media of their tweets or their mixtape. But just the fact that Wendy's has a mixtape, right? So anyways, thank you both for being here today.
Sure. Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
us.
And again, for more information, you'll find it in the bio. Visit cam.seu.edu. That's cam.seu.edu for more information on the College of Arts and Media and the Department of Communication. You can visit seu.edu for more information on Southeastern University. And be sure, if you're interested in our college, to sign up for our newsletter at the bottom of any page on cam.seu.edu to stay up to date on the events and happenings of CAM, including additional podcasts. And again, if you'd like to support the college, our departments, our events, any extracurricular opportunities, visit cam.su.edu. Have I said it enough? And hover over Friends of CAM in the navigation menu and click on Legacy Partners for more information on how you can support and contribute to excellence in private Christian liberal arts education. And thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.